Sri Lanka's most powerful news brand.
A very good evening to you. You're watching Newsfirst in Focus. Today we are going to talk to you about the policies that are surrounding the FTAs in our country and whether it's feasible to go into or look into FTAs with certain other countries in the region. We're going to talk to Mr. Kitmina Hevage of the Institute of Policy Studies. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you for being here with us. So now the Institute of Policy Studies has been able to carry out a preliminary study on a potential FTA with Malaysia. We also saw the Malaysian Prime Minister in the country a few weeks ago. Now, how feasible is it for us to move into an FTA or to talk about an FTA with Malaysia at the moment?
So, one of the key strategies, particularly over the last couple of years, has been moving towards FTAs with countries. So, right now there are 3 FTAs under negotiation, almost being signed with China, India and Singapore. And in kind of an extension of that policy is a potential FTA with Malaysia. Obviously the first step towards that is the political will, and the Prime Minister's arrival in Sri Lanka a couple of weeks ago in December, and his interest in signing an FTA is the first step towards that. In terms of the economic potential, it depends on multiple things. One is how much we are trading with Malaysia right now, and in terms of that, I think Sri Lankan Malaysian trade is at a space where an potential FTA would accrue quite a few benefits to the country, not just in terms of trade of goods, but also in terms of investment and in terms of trade in services.
Now we know that when, as you very correctly mentioned, when we speak about these FTAs that are in the pipeline with China, with India, there was a lot of public outrage. There were people saying, no, this is wrong, this should not be the case. Maybe because these were very powerful countries, China and India. Now when you talk about Malaysia as a country, let's tell our viewers whether we will have to face a similar situation, or whether the people of this country, in terms of the professionals, whether they will be sort of okay with what is happening.
I think there's a better political environment for a potential FTA with Malaysia, because obviously there is a certain level of trust deficit when it comes to Sri Lanka and India, and similarly with Sri Lanka and China. So politically I think it is more feasible in terms of, because Malaysia and Sri Lanka have relatively better relations, and society sees, Sri Lankan society sees Malaysia as a partner as well, rather than a big brother who's trying to impose their views. So I think politically it makes, but also in terms of economy, Malaysia is already a very close economic partner of Sri Lanka. It's I think the 6th biggest importer into Sri Lankan goods, and also one of the most prominent investors. If you think about our telecommunications sector, for example, 2 of our biggest companies are part investors are from Malaysia, similarly in education and construction. So Malaysia already has a very strong economic partnership with Sri Lanka. So I feel that the economics and the cultural and political sense it'll be relatively more easier. Obviously it has to go through negotiations, you'll have to have stakeholder consultations and make sure that the losers and the gainers of free trade agreements come to a consensus. But when you talk about India and China, because they are seen more as big brothers, so to speak, whereas Malaysia is more seen as a partner and a country with a similar economy or a similar size and so on.
FTAs are based on advantages and disadvantages to both parties. Now, if you take a look at, as you very correctly mentioned, China and India, you cannot actually say this is what we want, because they have the bargaining power, because they are the bigger country in this situation. But if you take a look at the FTA, possible FTA with a country like Malaysia, what are we looking at in terms of advantages to us as Sri Lankans?
I think before I move on, I slightly disagree with the premise of the question. In that, yes, economically, China and India might be the bigger economy, but we also have other options available in terms of why we bargain. Because China and India both see as a strategic partners, so they don't want to necessarily bully us into an agreement.
Right.
There are certain things that they also want to gain and give us.
Right.
And particularly with bigger economies, especially with India, they give us what is called special and differential treatment. So giving us more preference than what would be if we were equal partners. But going back to your question about Malaysia, I mean, so far our biggest export, one of our biggest exports there is in terms of rubber products.
Right.
For example, tires. And Sri Lankan tires that are being exported to Malaysia right now undergo a 25% tariff at the border. Right. If an FTA were to be signed, similar to those FTAs that Malaysia has already signed with other countries, and similar countries like Vietnam and other ASEAN countries, you could expect the tariff to reduce by 25%. Right. Or that's in the best case scenario, and even otherwise it would fall, which makes Sri Lankan exports there a lot more competitive than it is right now. Similarly, in terms of tea exports to Malaysia, similar tariff of about 20%. So such products that Sri Lanka is already quite competitive in when it comes to exporting to Malaysia will be even more competitive if a potential FTA, if FTA were to be signed and that scope were to be agreed upon.
Mr. Hevage, now when you talk about FTAs, the first thing the people start talking about is this free movement of persons, and to say this is Mode 4 and EDCA and all of these matters. We cannot come to an agreement and say no, we can't talk about it. Obviously we have to talk about that point as well. So when it comes to Malaysia, yes, there are people who are very talented in terms of the IT sector, in terms of a number of other businesses as well. So once again, free movement of persons, will it be a problem?
I think when we talk about free movement of persons, there are two segments of this, two models, so to speak. One is the European Union model, where you can move anywhere within the European Union without any restrictions and working. The other model, which I think Sri Lanka is also pursuing, is the Singaporean model, where you allow persons to move in terms of labor and so on, but at a controlled or in a regulated manner, which means that you have to first make sure that you can't fulfill that job or that supply from the local market, and then that the person who you're taking from the foreign market is of a higher standard than the local market, and so on. Yeah. And also then we can also, depending on negotiations, limit it to certain industries that where Sri Lankan supplies at a lower rate than what it would be if we were to cater only from the local market. Yeah. So I think when you talk about Mode 4 liberalization and free movement of persons, the worries that we'll go to a European Union style model, which is not politically realistic nor economically feasible in Sri Lanka. And I don't see that happening anytime soon, on kind of happening at all, yeah, to be very honest. The more likelihood is that we liberalize certain industries, depending on negotiations and what goes well, depending on consultations back home as well, and then liberalizing it to an extent where there are certain regulations upon which labor and free movement of persons is allowed.
Ms. Hevage, we had to go into a short commercial break, but before that I want to get this also out of the way. Now, we know that when we take a look at things from the economic perspective from home, we know that an FTA is being discussed now, and it actually comes into fruition about 15 or 20 years later. We've seen this in almost all of these FTAs that we spoke about as well. Now, Malaysia, when you talk about Malaysia, is this the first time that we're talking about it, or have we had something happening in the past as well?
There has been some discussion of a potential FTA with Malaysia, and this goes back historically when ASEAN was first formed and they wanted Sri Lanka to join as a member. But Sri Lanka at the time declined. But then after that, because Sri Lanka and Malaysia have had very close economic ties, there has always been some sort of discussion about a potential FTA. It just hasn't fallen within a government's policy mandate or a policy strategy, so to speak. So yes, in terms of the agreement being implemented, obviously it takes time to negotiate, and then there are clauses where you allow a certain grace period for it to kick in. Yeah. But that all depends on the negotiation process, and the negotiation process generally takes all that into consideration.
With that, we'll go into a short commercial break. Stay with us. You're watching Biz First in Focus. Welcome back. You're watching Biz First in Focus. We are in discussion with Mr. Kit Minahevage from the Institute of Policy Studies regarding a possible FTA with Malaysia. Now, Mr. Hevage, when we left off, we said that obviously these things take time. But when you take a look at everything that is happening in Malaysia, the fact that the Prime Minister during his visit said or possibly hinted of an FTA is in fact a good thing, because we can move into an FTA with a country is definitely advantageous to us as well in some way. Now, my point is a bit different. Now, Malaysia has been having FTAs with around 13 ASEAN countries. They seem to have been a bit late on getting into this FTA business. Why is Malaysia trying to do this now all of a sudden? And why Sri Lanka? Why are they looking at us?
Right. In terms of their strategy, obviously it took some time for the economy to be liberalized as well. So which is why it took time for them to get into the FTA game, so to speak. But now, as we see in the news, Malaysia is very involved with lots of prominent FTAs. For example, they are part of the TPP that included the US, but no longer. But so it's now the TPP is going forward without the US, so the TPP 11. And also they are part of the RCEP, which is the new mega regional with China, India, and so on. So I think Malaysia sees it as an opportunity to kind of integrate more with the South Asian region, because they see it part as the RCEP kind of strategy. And they see potential growth in this region, particularly with the Sri Lankan economy as well, because the Sri Lankan economy is also now looking at a more outward-oriented economic outlook. So that is looking more at developing the export sector and the investment sector, rather than more inward and protectionist sector. So I think Malaysia also probably sees that as an opportunity, and probably wants to get in first. Once the three negotiations, so Singapore, China and India, are done, then who comes next? And probably Malaysia wants to have a advantage in that sense of coming into Sri Lanka as early as possible.
Mr. Hevage, now there is this other point. Now, when you take a look at FTAs that are happening, you corrected me earlier to say that Sri Lanka is at a geographically advantageous position to bargain some things from our end. Now, when it comes to Malaysia, there are three agreements, as you said, Singapore, China and India, that are being discussed. If it comes to a situation where China does not like something that we have with Malaysia, or India doesn't like something that we have, is there a situation where we might have to choose between India or Malaysia, or China or Malaysia?
I don't think that potentiality will come about, because Malaysia already has FTAs with those two countries. So it's not necessarily pitting one against the other. Given that Malaysia already has an FTA with China and India, and that they are already also negotiating the RCEP with those two specific countries that are included, whenever they negotiate an FTA with Sri Lanka, it will be in tune with their already existing strategies with China and India. So I don't see a potentiality where we'll have to choose between the two countries, our two neighbors, and Malaysia, because there is anyway established partnership between those countries.
Now, viewers might not know the situation when it comes to when we are looking at an FTA from the Malaysian point of view. Because you all have done this study on a possible FTA, I want to ask you this question as well. Now, Malaysia politically at the moment is not in a good state, because they're looking at a possible election, and they have their Prime Minister who's having corruption scandals against him, so on and so forth. Bit of a similar situation here as well, but let's not go there. But my question to you is, these policies, we know that if you take a look at Sri Lankan policies, they tend to change from 5 years, or when a government changes, the policies also go out with them. Is it a similar situation in Malaysia, or how is their political situation and the economy?
I think one of the factors that has led Malaysia to be successful economically is that there has been a lot of continuity, particularly when it comes to economic policies. So yes, there might be changes in terms of the grand scheme of like bigger picture policies, but when it comes to Sri Lanka and FTA, I don't necessarily see a massive change where there is a need for them, even if there is a new Malaysian government, to make a massive U-turn. And one of the key factors that has actually led Malaysia to be successful is that they have had consistent economic policies in terms of their taxes and tariffs and so on, but also very liberalized and consistent investment policies, which is why over the years, regardless of who's in power or who's not in power, the economy has been able to grow and sustain through the crises that have hit Asian economies often because of that consistency. And there are bureaucratic checks against it changing massively just because there's a government change.
Now let me ask that question similarly from our point of view. Sri Lanka needs to go into FTAs to look at possible new markets that are in the region, obviously encouraged by the government as well. But how long are we going to see this for, and do you think with whatever possible changes there might be in the future when there is an election, these policies might also go along with them?
Well, Sri Lanka, it makes economic sense to look towards an outward, export-oriented, investment-friendly economy. One of the reasons why we are in the debt crisis that we are in is because of that it was very protectionist, and therefore we had to fund things domestically. So it makes economic sense to preserve an outward-looking economy. However, well, Sri Lankan politics is such that you cannot necessarily predict a policy strategy until you kind of see who's in power or who's coming into power and so on. But economically it makes a lot of sense if we do follow the strategy of maybe countries like Malaysia and so on, where there is consistency in economic policies, at least in terms of being open and friendly to exports, trade and investment.
On a similar interview like this, Mr. Hevage, I had the opportunity to talk to one of the IT professionals in our country. He showed me a book to say, this is the book that has been compiled by the Asian Development Bank as to how FTAs should be carried out in the region. And he said, when you take a look at this, the government has completely overlooked this book and done what they wanted when it came to ETCA. So my question to you, as professionals who are involved in this industry, who have carried out a preliminary study on this as well, how important is it for the government to actually sit and think, if the ADB or some other financial body, recognized financial body, has carried out a study, or in fact even your preliminary study, how important is it for the government to sit and study well before they actually jump and do something? It's
very important that governments take into consideration multiple stakeholders, the views of multiple stakeholders. So obviously it's important that they consult international organizations like the World Bank or the IMF, Asian Development Bank and so on, and then think tanks like IPS and so on, but also important to consider the views of important stakeholders like the IT industry and other professionals and those who are engaged in exports. But obviously there is no one size fits all model for FTA negotiations. When the ADB gives out a handbook, that handbook is a guide. But it's important that Sri Lanka tailors that guide in a manner that it fits the Sri Lankan economy best. But in terms of the key pillars of consultations and having research-led policy, so evidence-based policy, it's a strategy that has to be considered, and it's good practice in general to be taken forward.
Mr. Hevage, with that we have to go into another short commercial break. Stay with us. We are talking about FTAs, possible FTA with Malaysia. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You are watching BizFirst in Focus. We are in discussion with Mr. Kitmina Hevage of the Institute of Policy Studies regarding a possible free trade agreement with Malaysia. We spoke about the advantageous situations with regard to going into this or discussing a possible FTA with Malaysia. Now let's talk about the dark side. What are we losing?
The obvious losses are going to be in terms of tariff revenue. Of course, Sri Lanka taxes imports from Malaysia, and that revenue will be lost. But in terms of the net gain, I think we need to, whenever there is an FTA, whenever there is a trade agreement, there are obviously losses and gains. But what our study has found is that there will be a net gain if such a agreement were to be signed.
How so?
In the sense that it increases our exports, particularly our exports in sectors that we are competitive in Malaysia already in. Like I said before, things like rubber products, tea and so on are already competitive but get taxed quite a lot. So we expect our exports to increase by about 2.34 million per year, which is quite
US
a lot.
dollars.
US dollars. US dollars 2.34 million, which is quite a bit when it comes to the Sri Lankan export sector. In terms of the losses, obviously it depends on what is negotiated, but we see some areas where Malaysian imports might get reduced tariffs, and that loss will be compensated for by the gains that are made in the export sector. And more gains, obviously these sort of models don't take into account the sort of gains that are being made when investment is open. For example, if more investment in the IT sector and other sectors were allowed, for example, the telecommunications sector that is already quite prominent for Malaysia, they get involved, that brings in more trade, that brings in more investment and more dollars into the economy. And that is almost uncalculatable because it depends on what we have right now. So usually what has been seen is that these sort of FTAs and these sort of agreements have had a net benefit, particularly to countries like Sri Lanka, where we already are competitive in certain sectors, and this is one of those areas that we have.
Mr. Hewage, now I want to ask you another question. We know you mentioned the telecommunications sector. Malaysia has a lot of power when it comes to the telecommunications sector here, and when we talk about a possible FTA, even though companies are not considered countries, there are companies that are carrying out telecommunications here in our country that are very powerful in the business sector, economy. Will there be a problem between those companies, or are we saying no, there might not be anything wrong?
I don't think so, because even for the companies that have already established in Sri Lanka, it's an opportunity for further investments. And generally what we see is, for example, when you take the RCEP, a lot of companies that are already invested in the countries that are negotiating are the ones who promote the trade agreement and negotiation, because that means that they can bring in more investment into the country more freely. They can, kind of trade more, particularly when it comes to the industrial sector, construction and so on. And and we see a lot of Malaysian outward investment. I think Malaysia has graduated to an extent where now they're not just looking at inward investment into their own country, they're sending out investment. So Malaysia in itself, the Malaysian economy and their companies are looking towards small economies like Sri Lanka to invest in and get those advantages in creating those linkages between Malaysia and other countries.
If Sri Lanka says your negotiations don't work out, we don't want an FTA with Malaysia, where will Malaysia go next?
Well, Malaysia already has a plethora of FTAs in the pipeline. They already have FTAs with India, China and so on, but also already they are negotiating the RCEP. They're also in negotiations with some of the other ASEAN countries. There's an ASEAN regional agreement that is being negotiated. So it's not a case where Sri Lanka saying no is going to create a scramble in Malaysia.
Now the other side. If Malaysia does not extend its hands to have an FTA with Sri Lanka, does Sri Lanka have another option to say, no, let's not go to Malaysia, let's go to somewhere else, that sort of thing?
Well, Sri Lanka
or is this, if we lose this opportunity, is this the waste of an opportunity, and we could have actually worked something out of this, and we could have also had a better situation?
It is a wasted opportunity, in the sense that because Malaysia and the East Asian market is such a lucrative market right now, it is one of the fastest growing regions as a whole in the world. So tapping into that market, because right now we are quite dependent on the US and EU markets. It makes up about 51% of our exports. So it's important that we diversify and move into East Asian markets like Malaysia and ASEAN. So not negotiating, or particularly if there is political will by both sides, just not negotiating for no obvious reason is a missed opportunity. Obviously, it depends on how the negotiations pan out and whether it makes economic sense for the country as a whole.
Without letting go of this good opportunity, or without wasting this opportunity that we've got, how long do you think an FTA, to realize this situation of a possible FTA, how long do you think that will take?
Well, I think we first need to finalize the 3 FTAs that we are negotiating right now with China, Singapore and India. The Singapore FTA is reportedly close to be signed by delegations. So I think we have quite a lot on our plate already. And given that our economy is quite small and our professional capacity is quite small as well, it's important that we clear that out first. And then move on. I mean, as long as there is political will by Malaysia and Sri Lanka, and that momentum can be carried forward, particularly now that the Malaysian Prime Minister is also is showing keenness to do this, then over the next few years, I think it provides a good opportunity for us to initiate negotiations. Negotiations generally take about 2 years on average, and then it can be taken on from there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hevage, for joining us on this first night and talking to us about a possible FTA that we can reach with Malaysia. As Mr. Hevage says, if we do not pursue this, and if we do not take a look at what we have here, it could be considered a wasted opportunity. So a message to the professionals out there, a message to the politicians out there, to take a look at the study that was done by the Institute of Policy Studies and maybe expedite this process so that we can have a chance in the future. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Chaturanga Paraj. We'll join you next week as well. Take care.